Folks in Atlanta paying their respects to Rayshard Brooks at a public memorial. NBC News correspondent Blaine Alexander joins me now from the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And Blaine, what are you hearing from people there today, both those who knew Rayshard Brooks and those who didn't?
Well, Allison, a lot of people are coming just because they say they want to pay their respects. And many of the people that I spoke to in line say that they didn't know him personally, but are coming for that reason, either because they wanted to pay their respects or because they wanted to be there. And many people, as they said, just to support the family. So this is the first of 2 days of events planned here for Rayshard Brooks. Today is the only public memorial. This is actually a public viewing. So for about 4 hours today, people are allowed to line up here behind me, go into the side of Ebenezer Baptist Church here in Atlanta and go in and pay their respects. Now, tomorrow is going to be the actual memorial service, the sort of funeral, homegoing service. And that one is open only to family and friends by invitation only. So we do know that, of course, this is taking place at the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church. This was the congregation that was once pastored by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Well, tomorrow, his daughter, the Reverend Bernice King, is going to be speaking at the memorial service along with a number of other people, Allison. But really, this is, as many people said, a chance to come out and pay their respects for Rayshard Brooks, who truly has become, for so many people, a kind of rallying cry when it comes to people demanding police reform.
Blaine, I can only imagine that so many people want to come out and pay their respects. What is the church doing to protect people there from the coronavirus?
Very good question. So one thing kind of starts with the line, and the other thing is that not everybody's allowed in at the same time, which is why we saw people lined up here behind me for parts of the day, on and off throughout the day, because they were only allowing certain people in at a certain time. Social distancing is being practiced. Everyone's wearing masks, people who have to, who are working inside, but they also have some people kind of standing there at the end of that line to provide masks to people who don't have them. So certainly one of the things that they are taking into extreme precautions. We also know that they're doing temperature screenings as people are asked to enter the church as well. Allison.
Blaine, last week, Tyler Perry offered to pay for Brooks's funeral. How else is he being honored this week?
Well, this is the first of 2 days. Tomorrow, again, I think is going to be really what a lot of people are going to be watching. Again, it's close to the public, close to the press, but there is one camera allowed inside. And we're going to hear from Reverend Bernice King. We're going to hear from a number of gospel singers who are coming in to speak. We're also going to hear the pastor of this church, Reverend Raphael Warnock, speaking as well. Interestingly enough, he happens to be a Democratic candidate for Senate, but he is serving in his capacity as the pastor of this church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, and delivering the eulogy tomorrow.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.